Good evening, everyone. I want you to indulge me just a second before I actually introduce tonight's program. I just have to first tell you what an amazing thing it is to actually see people in an audience. I think it's an amazing feat of where we are, hopefully where we are. Statewide festival to cancel its programming because of the coronavirus. Since that time, festival staff did an incredible pivot. In addition to producing a weekly program called Shelf Life, they created a purely virtual festival last year. So over the last 2 years, these programs have continued to connect us to some of the nation's leading authors and thinkers. The shift in these programs not only enabled wider access to rich work and discussion, but they also made us feel inspired and less isolated in a time when our connections to one another were much harder, I think, to maintain. So before we get started, I want to recognize some folks for what they've been able to accomplish over these last 2 years and for creating this, the 28th Virginia Festival of the Book. This includes the many community volunteers and Virginia Humanities staff who support and volunteer for the festival events. And of course, it also includes 3 individuals in particular. Erin Donovan, who many of you may not have met yet. She recently joined us as the Center for the Book Associate. Sarah Lawson, Associate Director for the Center for the Book. And last, but never least, Jane Kulo, the Director of the Festival and Center for the Book. So join me and please give me raucous applause for all the people I just mentioned. And so now tonight's program. I want to welcome you to Halfway Home, a conversation with Dr. Reuben Jonathan Miller at the Virginia Festival of the Book, a program of Virginia Humanities. I'm Matthew Gibson, Executive Director of Virginia Humanities, and I'm also pleased to welcome you to this, our first hybrid festival. I'm thrilled that we can present Dr. Miller in person to all of you here and via live stream, so that people who've joined us from afar can engage in an issue so critical for our time. I'm grateful that we have this opportunity to share Dr. Miller's work and hear more about steps that we can take in our community, state, and nation to understand the human stories of incarceration and consider how policies might change to support people who've been formerly incarcerated. I'd like to acknowledge support from our premier sponsor, the Joseph and Robert Cornell Memorial Foundation, and these major sponsors, Michelle and David Baldacci, the Dominion Energy Charitable Foundation, the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. Their support helped make this event possible. If you too would like to support the Virginia Festival of the Book and events like this, you can always go to vabook.org and make a donation. So for a few quick housekeeping notes. First and foremost, as always, please silence your phones. And remember to use hashtag VABookFest if you post about this event on social media. The conversation will open up at the end to audience questions, and in order to keep all in our community as safe as possible, please keep your masks on at this event. Speakers, like myself, have shown that we have negative test results before removing our masks. And so following the event, Dr. Miller will also be moved to the signing area in the back of the room to sign books hopefully that you've purchased. Over there, in the middle. Finally, please fill out an evaluation after today's event. These evaluations provide useful information that helps us keep the festival open and free to the public, but also the festival even better than it could be ever each year. You can complete it online at vabook.org/feedback, or by scanning the QR code on the back of your festival schedule. And now, I am delighted to introduce our speakers. Dr. Reuben Jonathan Miller, author of Halfway Home, is a sociologist, criminologist, and a social worker who teaches at the University of Chicago in the School of Social Service Administration, where he studies and writes about race, democracy, and the social life of the city. He has been a member of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey, a fellow at the New America Foundation, and the Rockefeller Foundation, and a visiting scholar at the University of Texas at Austin and Dartmouth College. A native son of Chicago, he lives with his wife and children on the city's south side. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Miller. And with Dr. Miller today and moderating this event is Yahusef Medina, Associate Director of Community Initiatives at Virginia Humanities. Yahusef also serves on the Latino Advisory Board for the Commonwealth of Virginia, and much of his career has been focused on youth development and the juvenile justice and K-12 public school systems. Please welcome Yahusef Medina. And without further ado, and to get me off the stage, I'll turn it over to both of you. And I'll also try to hand you this. There you go. Thank you.
Test. Okay. Thank you, Matthew. And welcome, Dr. Miller. It's been quite a journey. I almost thought that you weren't going to be able to make it. You know, but thankfully you're here.
I'm grateful. Grateful. Honored to be here.
Indeed.
It's a highlight.
I wanted to just start by really commending you. You thanked me earlier for, we've been spending the day together, and Dr. Miller thanked me for my service in, you know, the juvenile justice world and K-12 education. I think a lot of times coming from the neighborhoods that we come from, it can be jarring or even traumatic sometimes to go back to those same neighborhoods and do the work that's required. But you've done a phenomenal work here with, you know, 15 plus years of field research and, you know, basically following the lives of these people day in and day out in the same neighborhoods that, you know, you come from. So I just want to commend Dr. Miller for that great work, and we can give another round of applause. Thank you. It's important that we build each other up in those ways. It's not enough of us doing that, so thank you.
I appreciate that.
So I guess we'll just start off halfway home.
Yeah.
What does that mean to you, and you know, what is this book? What does it mean to you, and tell us about it.
Yeah, so the title, you know, plays on two ideas. So on the one hand, I did a lot of work in halfway houses. So I spent about 3.5 years doing what we call participant observation. So that's where you go where people go, you do what people do in halfway houses on Chicago's south and west side. And also the idea of being kind of betwixt and between things. You know, the idea of being stuck. It occurs to me, you know, that we live in a country where when people make a mistake, we push them out of all of the life-giving institutions of a free society. So for example, in our country, there are 44,000 laws, policies, and administrative sanctions that target people with criminal records. 19,000 labor market restrictions. 19,000. So we make it almost impossible for folks to get a job. 1,000 restrictions on housing, making it almost impossible for people to rent a place to stay. 4,000 policies that target civic participation, make it almost impossible for people to change the law and policy apparatus that hems them in, at least in the ways that most people find meaningful, you know? So folks have to find ways around it. So we've created a situation in which people are stuck. We've built no place for people to be. And so when they come home, some having made a mistake, many having not made the mistake for which they were incarcerated. 95% of all cases are resolved through a plea deal. But 3,000 people, you know, have been exonerated since 1989. And the work you have to do to find exoneration, so the people who are innocent, the people who have done things and perhaps changed their lives, there are people who have done things and have not changed. All of them are stuck. None of them ever quite make it home. And so this is what the book is about. And you asked me, like, to say something a little bit about the book. So just to give a little background. So what I did was I followed people who were moving in and through jails, prisons, and police station lockup facilities across the country, but primarily in Chicago, Detroit, New York, and a few smaller places throughout the country. And I spent a lot of time with people and their families. I would sit at the table with folks. I'd meet them, on the day they get released. I follow them into the labor market. I do my best to understand their lives. And so I wrote about that. That's been my research. But also, while I was doing this work, my brother was arrested. So my brother was arrested and incarcerated, and he went to prison. He went to prison in Michigan while I was working at the University of Michigan doing research in Michigan prisons. And so what I decided to do was to write about, on the one hand, how families cope with and how they attempt to receive their loved ones when they come home, and what it means to come home from the perspective of the folks that I followed. But also to write about what it meant to do this work while I was also caring for a loved one who was inside and was preparing to come home.
And I'm glad that you mentioned that. You wrote this book with great vulnerability and transparency. It leads me to my next question. One of the things you speak about is proximity being a gift, right?
Yeah.
And sort of shattering this whole notion in academia that one needs to be distant from their work in order to have objective, truthful scholarship. You speak about the mind-body duality. Can you speak a little bit about that and your process and approach to writing this book and why proximity is a gift?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. So we're taught, certainly academics, but not just academics, I mean journalists too. We're taught that you need to make the world strange in order to understand it. So you have to treat the world as if it's not something that you know, and we do this so that you don't take for granted things. And we do this so that one might understand, for example, the role and the work that the mundane, routine, everyday things that we encounter do in shaping our lives. And that's very valuable. But in teaching ourselves to distance ourselves from the folks we study, and in many ways from ourselves, from our own thoughts, feelings, actions, from what it means to be in this flesh, from what it means to, say, grow up in a neighborhood like we grew up in, or to have friends who move in and through the systems that we do, to pretend like we don't know what it means to visit a loved one who's in a cage. Well, that puts me at a disadvantage in some ways too. So the things that I learned by making the world strange, by pretending like the world is an alien environment, I can learn some things. It's valuable. It's a valuable technique. But the things that I miss different ways to connect with folks. The things that I never think to ask. Because I'm looking for the uniqueness of a situation instead of the thing that connects us as people. There are also things that I miss because I never engage with what a thing really feels like, So what I tried to do is write the book from a feeling, from what it smelled like to be in a place, from what it felt like in the pit of my stomach when I saw my loved one marched away in chains. And it's from that place that I built rapport with other people while I was moving through the spaces. And it's from that place that I sought to understand what was happening in the lives of people, and not just people who I cared about, people who I was following, who I was coming to care about, and was trying to get to know.
And is this a new approach to scholarship? Were you following any trend in writing this way, or is this just something that spoke to you that you felt like you had to do? Where did you pull this inspiration from to write in such a way? Because it's almost like the book is a memoir, but it's also research filled with data and statistics and so forth, but you blend it and weave it in a way that it's palatable for even an average reader. It's not necessarily an academic, for academic eyes only, if you will.
I appreciate you.
Yeah.
I was trying to not, so I make a couple presumptions. And this is a part of my politics too. So on the one hand, I don't think academics are special. You know what I mean? So like there's no need for me to communicate in a specialized language that only a handful of people, really get down with. There was no need for me to pretend like only people in the ivory tower had something to say about the social situation of others, And what that comes from is not a traditional scholarly, approach, a specific scholarly tradition. What that comes from is a Black intellectual tradition that treats it all, like everything as if it's a part of the knowledge-making experience. So I come out of a Black intellectual tradition that views Nina Simone as someone that might help me understand the social world, that views James Baldwin as a kind of theorist, that views, and if Nina Simone and James Baldwin are theorists, if Fela Kuti can help me understand what it means to exist in the world in a particular kind of way, so can the people in my study. They're just as important as, say, Pierre Bourdieu or Michel Foucault or whoever the giant scholar is that I'm taught to follow in the academic tradition, in the traditional academic canon. They're important, and they speak. Nietzsche speaks in the book. But so too does Nina, so too does James Baldwin, so too does Ronald Simpson Bay, who does 27 years on a wrongful conviction, who's telling me about the world and how it hangs together in ways that are very important. So too does a guy I call Jimmy, who's rejected at every turn when he's trying to seek social services. He's telling me, he's theorizing how the world works, if I care to listen. And if I care to hold his opinion, his theory of the social world, not his opinion, his theory of how the world works, if I care to hold it in as high esteem as I would Michel Foucault on prisons or something like that. Foucault is no more important to me than Jimmy is. And if Foucault and Jimmy are important, then I'm important too. I have something to say too. And this is a part of the Black intellectual tradition, thank you. This is a part of that tradition that values song and spirituality. It thinks about what it means to be in this body in a given moment in time, and what it means to be in community with others. That's where it comes from.
Beautiful. Well said, yeah. So, thank you for that context. I wanted to open the discussion describing proximity. And to make this more intimate, I want to involve the audience, and it's no shame or anything, but as we speak about proximity, how many people here can relate to that proximity with regard to criminal justice? Anybody been personally impacted by the criminal justice system, having known a relative or what have you that's been involved, right? So that's good. We make this room a little bit closer. We're going to get to some of the statistics that he brings out in his book a little bit later. But you start the book with juxtaposing these two Black figures and I'm glad you did it, because I wasn't familiar with these two persons prior to reading this. But you have Jean-Baptiste Pont du Sablé, right? Who is, for those that don't know, is the often forgotten but first non-native resident and founder, can't really say founder, but non-native resident of Chicago. And then also Winston Moore, who's America's first Black warden, and also the first Black warden of Cook County Jail, where you spent a lot of your time at. Why these two people, and do their two stories somehow foreshadow or parallel the experience of Black men with the carceral system in America?
I think they do. Thank you for this question. History, for me, is alive. I think we can't understand how the courtroom works if we don't understand the seat of the judge, which means if I don't understand how people come to the positions that they're in. So there's the personal social history of the person who's administering judgment, and then there's also the position of the judge. And how we've come to endow that position with a particular kind of power. We're not the actors in the field. There's the prosecutor and the defense attorney. And there's a history behind this. And then there's a history of why and how we get something like mass incarceration in a specific locale. So there's the history of mass incarceration in Charleston, in Seville. There's the history of mass incarceration in Chicago. And I can't understand that when I'm a chaplain in the Cook County Jail, how and why 80% of the men who walk through that jail are black in a city that's 1/3 black. I can't understand that really if I don't have an understanding of how they interact with the systems that they keep bumping into. And so history's alive and well. It helps me to understand what it is that I'm looking at. And I hope it helps us to understand how and why people act and move in the ways that they do to some extent. In the same way, the history of Chicago begins by being founded, as you said, it's a strong word, but the first settler, non-native settler, is a Haitian, a black Haitian man, DuSable. And DuSable, this black, wealthy trader who settles on the bank of this river and takes a Potawatomi wife and has this beautiful, perhaps strange-looking family, in this moment in history, who's responsible for the prosperity of the new residents who come and follow him, is arrested as a sympathizer by the British Army, and he's held in a fort not far, sent off and held eventually in a fort not far from Detroit, which is also sort of an interesting history. And he's perhaps well off at some point in his life, but he dies penniless. He dies penniless, like many formerly incarcerated black men in our country. And Winston Moore, he's a psychologist. I get this. I first came across the history of Winston Moore, the warden of the first warden of Cook County, and the first director of corrections, first black director of corrections, really in the country, one of them. And I come across this history, this interesting history, as told by historian Melanie Newport, who's at the University of Connecticut, who's got a book coming out later this year. But Winston Moore is nicknamed Buddha. He's called a bear of a man. He too is arrested. He's arrested for the crime of supposedly beating inmates while he's there. And so these black men of relative means are shamed and arrested and sent away at the founding of these institutions. At the founding of these institutions, in the shape that we see them today on the one hand, and at the founding of the city on the other hand, at the founding of the Department of Corrections. He's in charge of the expansion of that place. And so 3 expansion projects later, you go from locking away, a few hundred people in a given year, on any given day, to, at the height of mass incarceration, the city of Chicago has 10,000 people held in its custody on any given day. It's the largest single-site jail facility in the country, and it's interesting that it has this remarkably racist history.
Powerful. You got a number of themes in the book, and one that stuck out to me was this separation from innocence and the beginning of black guilt.
Yeah.
You speak about this.
Yeah.
And being guilty before a law is even broken.
Yeah.
Can you articulate that a little bit more and speak on, what you were going into with those topics?
Yeah, so this Winston Moore and Jean-Baptiste Pointe-DuSable are an example of one important moment in history that tells us how institutions start and what it means to have this as, be part and parcel of the way that thing functions. So that by the time I show up at the Cook County Jail, it makes sense that 80% of that population is black in a city that's 1/3 black. Because I know something about the history. I know something about how it operates, how it moves. And in the same way, when I meet my guys, so I followed about 250 people across the country. I write about 11 in the book, but I followed 250. And in the same way, when I meet my guys, I'm trying to get my head around how and why do we get to a place where, when I ask them how many times they've been arrested, they tell me too many times to count. It was 15 arrests on average for the guys that I found. And for the guys that I found, the average age of first arrest was 14 years old. 14 years old. Well, where does that come from? How do we get to that place? Well, this starts with the production of blackness itself. Blackness is something that's made. It's something that's produced. It's not to say that it's not real in its consequences. It's not to say that to be black is fake and we can just give it up or something like that. That's not what I'm saying at all. But this is something that was made out of whole cloth that happens at the moment of encounter. With Portuguese slave traders, it happens at the moment of encounter. This in the association between blackness and violence, and happens because black folks are resisting capture in that very early moment. So that first encounter is a violent encounter. I'm putting my hands on you. Get in that ship. And what do? You fight. Of course you do. We're lauding it now, but the Ukrainians are fighting. Right? Give me your country. No, I'm going to lose my life first. What did the president of Ukraine say today? Life doesn't matter to me if my life doesn't save the lives of others. It doesn't quite matter in relation to the children who are being killed right now. So what do you do when you put your hands on my family? Right? What am I supposed to do when you put your hands on my family? I'm supposed to fight. And I do. And there was resistance at every moment of encounter. Every moment there was resistance. Every moment there was violent, armed revolt. Armed when they could get their hands on it, bare hands when they couldn't. In the slave ship, in the barracoon, right? In most plantations, thousands of revolts. And in response to those revolts was dropped the label violent. You are a violent people. I understand you to be a violent people. Every one of you, every part of you, not just you, the whole group that you come from. So much so that now social psychologists have found that when polled is the wrong word, but when surveyed, people believe that black children, for example, are 4 years older than they are when we asked about how old they are, and are considered to be more guilty than their white counterparts, because black people have been separated from their innocence. They've been separated, they've been labeled violent, presumed guilty, separated from their innocence. So when I meet a guy, the first moment of arrest is at 11, 12, 14 years old. And the number of times they've been arrested, I ask how many times you've been arrested, they say 10, 15, too many to count. So this is how I'm trying to understand this. This is how I understand, how I've come to understand the repeated interactions with the criminal justice system that people have encountered. But this is the point about the importance of history. These things don't just happen in a vacuum. You know what I mean? Let me give you another example, and perhaps before we move on, but just to give you one more example. I interviewed a man who was a survivor of an infamous torture ring, an infamous police torture ring. This isn't in the book. This is a part of the work. And he was tortured by a ring of officers called the Midnight Crew. And two of the officers that tortured him and another guy were a part of this Midnight Crew.
You mentioned one of them in the book, correct? The ringleader of the officer.
Like Burge, yeah. I'm sure Burge showed up. So this gentleman, I asked him when he first started getting in trouble with the police. And his first encounters with the police started when he was 10 or 11 years old. And the way those encounters started is those encounters started with the police, just basically, you know, the kids would be gathered together playing. Well, if 3 to 5 people, 3 or more people are gathered, that's called mob action, right? And so the police start by, you know, talking to the kids, patting them down, spreading them out against the car. That escalates into them a little older, you know, 11, 12 years old, grabbing the kids, putting them in the car, letting them out, 12, 13 years old, taking them down to arrest them, or dropping them off in notoriously racist neighborhoods. So much so, this was so routine for these kids that they made a game out of it. So every time they saw the police, the game was to run, right? Like get out of there, break out, right? Like the cops come, we're gonna bounce, we're gonna run. This is because these kids were separated from their innocence. Why is this suspicious that 3 to 5 children are standing together? Why is that a suspicious activity? This doesn't say that gangs don't exist and that people don't engage in violence, but the question is, what does it mean to criminalize everyday behaviors of youth? This is what that point is.
And is this conditioning in your research, or if you can even speak to it, is this intentional? Is it something that is consciously done, or has it been systematized and indoctrinated into this American way of life so much so that it seems right to do or natural to do on behalf of these officers?
Yeah, I don't think it's intentional. You know, no, it's not intentional. I mean, let me say this. Sometimes it's intentional. There are racist people in the world. There are people who have disdain in their hearts, off their lips, like it drips off their lips for black people, for poor people, for people of color, for the vulnerable. There are people who have disdain for them. Most people don't. You know, it's not intentional to clutch a purse. It's not. I'm afraid. I've been conditioned to be afraid when I see groups of men or something like that. But why? Groups of black men. But why? I'm not afraid when I see groups of white men. I don't have the same sort of fear. No, it's not. I don't think it's always intentional. I don't think it's most often intentional. I think though, we've come to do things in a particular kind of way. It is structure. That is what structure is. It is when patterns of behavior, when thoughts and beliefs ossify, when they becomes the go-to, when it becomes the common sense at the time. You know.
Right. I wonder if that's almost worse. That it's not intentional, but that it's just such a part of the psyche that it's become commonplace, you know?
Well, here's an example. You know, we've got 44,000 laws, policies, and administrative sanctions, right? At some point, it has become the way we write laws to exclude people with felony records, with criminal records. As an example. This is the way you write a law. Of course you won't provide services for people with criminal records. Why would you do that? It is worse because I have to think actively against it to not do it. You know? Of course a landlord is going to reject the application of a person with a criminal record. That's what you do, right? That's how you keep your neighborhood safe, isn't it? I have to actively work against it to not do it. Yeah, this is one of the reasons why I think it's worse. It's pernicious. It's sneaky. It shows up in the everyday way that we go about handling our daily activities.
You mentioned, I even heard you mention it earlier. What happened in 1972? And when I say you mentioned this, I quoted you. You said, the year mass incarceration began in earnest.
Yeah.
So what does that mean? Can you unpack that? What does that mean?
1972 is the last year. So in 1973 we see a 27-year. Every year for 27 straight years, we increased in this country the number of people we arrested and the rate at which we arrested people. We did that for 27 straight years. And of course, who we arrested was so targeted that sociologists decided to repurpose a term, mass incarceration, to help us understand it. The mass incarceration was really about poor black men. And of course, it's not just poor black men who get arrested, it's poor more broadly. But 1972 is the year that this begins. And it's important, people ask, well, why? Why did we engage in this experiment in human caging? Why did we start mass incarceration? There are a few reasons that we started. On the one hand, the 1972, the early 1970s, we're off on the heels of the Great Society, and the public is tired of public investment in social welfare policy more generally, in help for the poor. The country is tired of helping the poor. Of course, public investment in social welfare policy was coded as public investment in black people, because black people were more likely to be on welfare than others. This kind of rhetoric that we were circulating in. And we also saw the death of rehabilitation that happened in this moment. So for nearly 100 years, the modus operandi of the U.S. Criminal justice system was for rehabilitation. If you asked Americans what prison was for, they said rehabilitation. Prison administrators were polled. There's something called the 1870 Declaration of Principles. This is a declaration from prison administrators that say that the job of the prison is to, quote, hold the offender up. Theodore Roosevelt in 1913 says that you judge a prison based on the ability of the formerly incarcerated person when they get out, I'm paraphrasing, to find work and contribute to their family. Right? So this was the vision up and through the 1970s. So on the heels of the civil rights movement, right, where protest was framed as crime in the street, of course. On the heels of public disaffection with public investment in the lives of poor people, which was racially coded as poor black people, which is happening around the same time. On the heels of a real spike in crime, and on the heels of a decision that rehabilitation no longer worked. This is despite studies that said the opposite. But a few loud voices said that rehabilitation didn't work based on a few faulty studies that are happening at the same time. The kind of flashpoint moment is 1974. There's an article that gets published in Foreign Affairs by Robert Martinson called What Works in Corrections. And what he found, or what his group found, he was one of like 92 authors, something. It was a long study. Or it was a multiple author study. He wasn't the first author, and he wasn't his lab. But what they found was that rehabilitative programming in prisons didn't work. The study had many problems. They would do things like count as a rehabilitative intervention a meeting with a social worker that happened twice in a given year, or something like that. To sort of come up with these with this outcome. But it's an example of the thinking in this moment. People think that rehabilitation doesn't work, and so they say that the purpose of prison shouldn't be for rehabilitation. The purpose of prison then changes. It changes from rehabilitation to warehousing. We no longer believe in rehabilitation, even though the science says it works, even though the data suggests that it works. We now want to just get people off the street. We now believe that the role of the prison is to protect us from these evildoers, these bad people who can't be reformed no matter how much investment no matter how much money you pour into them. It's a waste of time and money. And so this moment represents the end of an era where Americans believe that public investment matters, where Americans believe that rehabilitation is possible.
It almost sounds like a predecessor to or similar campaign as what was done in the 90s around the super predator, juvenile, sort of these faulty statistics, but kind of fear-mongering tactics to get people in line, no?
That's absolutely right. This is the bedrock for those kinds of moves that we see later. This is the seed of the tough on crime era that's happening in this moment. And something else is happening in this moment. Prior to 1972, the prison was mostly white. This isn't inconsequential. about 2/3, I think it was 65 or 66% of the prison was white prior to the 1970s. By 1990, the prison is 2/3 non-white. So this shift in what we would call the rehabilitative ideal happens alongside a demographic shift in who's being arrested and incarcerated too. We can't forget that either. You know, these things are happening together.
So, and I'm going to defer to the audience a little bit on this, because I wrote some words down here, right? Some of the verbiage that stood out to me in this book, and I'm going to bring it to a question to you. But I'm going to name some words, and the audience can just shout out what comes to mind when I say these words, right? Taken, shipped away, cages, exploited, power dynamics, institutionalized, freedom, separated from family and home, cursed, guilty, convict leasing, chains and corpses. There seems to be, as was mentioned, a direct link between slavery and mass incarceration. Were these words chosen purposely, or is this just the reality? And what is the link? What is the link between slavery and mass incarceration?
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. I mean, of course the words were chosen. You know, really, of course. So using language like cages, not instead of, but in tandem with our thoughts about imprisonment. I think it's just more accurate. I think people are in cages. I think we cage people, you know? And I'm not the only one, of course. You know, 1.5 million people who are thinking in this way. You asked about the link between slavery and mass incarceration. I mean, so, well, you know, other folks have pointed out, for example, you know, the 13th Amendment and the role of the 13th Amendment. I mean, there's sort of a due process clause in the bills that establish, for example, black citizenship. So the 13th and 14th Amendment establish black citizenship, and and the 4th Amendment didn't establish black citizenship, it establishes citizenship broadly, but each one of these amendments has something like a due process clause. No slavery and voluntary servitude unless for in due process of like a conviction. There's language like that in 3 of the amendments in the Constitution, so that's one direct link. But also our understanding, the linking of blackness with criminality, for example, the linking of poverty and idleness with violence, fear, and criminality, come out of this moment. When we decided to capture folks. And then the remnants, so this language is from all over the book, right? So it does different things in different places, but when we think about, chain gangs and convict leasing, and these are the techniques of carceral control that are rolled out at a given moment in time. Which moment? At the moment of black emancipation. Yes. At the moment of black freedom. We roll out the chains at the moment of black freedom, which is a powerful thing to think about. And just to respond to one specific thing that you talked about, like chains and corpses, this comes from the title of a chapter where I follow a family that's really coping with the premature death of their loved one. There's a man who I follow who's not black. He's a white man who did 44 years for a crime that he committed. And he completely changes his life in those 44 years. And he finds family while he's on the inside. And he engages in a long-term relationship, over 30 years, with a woman who's a dynamic activist, reformer, who's working with men on the inside, with lifers specifically. And he's home for 2 years and he dies of cancer. 44 years on the inside, 2 years on the outside, he dies of cancer. Corpses. And he, like most people who we lock away, are susceptible to premature death. So the literature tells us that the prison is something of an incubator of sickness and disease. This isn't a direct link to his cancer, but the public health literature tells us for every year someone spends in a jail or prison, they use years off of their life expectancy. In fact, one study by Evelyn Patterson, who's a sociologist out of Vanderbilt University, she finds that for every year someone spent in a New York state prison, they lost 2 years off their life course. She used life table models to do the estimation. The literature tells us that people report worse health in the year when they leave prison than they did when they come in. We know that chronic illnesses and communicable diseases are much higher inside prisons than anywhere else. This is why we were sure that prison would incubate COVID, that prisons would become a death trap for COVID-19, and of course it did. This is why everyone who works in the prison warned everybody who didn't that the prison is the place to look after the nursing home. And of course it was. And of course we didn't respond to it because we think these people are guilty and deserve whatever they get, you see, even death. But public health research also tells us that people who are held in American jails or prisons are something like 11 times more likely to die from any cause within the first 2 weeks of their release than members of the general population die in that period. Any cause. And so I was trying to wrestle with really something I heard James Baldwin say. So he writes this open letter. It's called an open letter to my sister Angela Davis on the occasion of her arrest. It's written in 1971, I believe, by James Baldwin. And he opens that letter by saying, by remarking on how much of a shame it was to see her arrest. And he says something like, it would seem to me at this late hour that we would rise up and rip off the manacles. We'd be so revolted by the sight of chains on black flesh that we would rise up and rip off the manacles. But no, he says, we count our security in chains. We count our safety in chains and corpses. We count our safety in chains and corpses. So we lock people away because we think it makes us more safe. And then, when they come out, we make a world where it's impossible for them to eat, to work, to live, to connect with their families because we're afraid of them. We count our safety in their chains and in their premature death. But the problem is that any criminologist worth their salt will tell you that precarity not only leads to the premature death of formerly incarcerated people, right? Precarity leads to premature death, but precarity leads to more crime and more violence. So in our fear, we've written 44,000 laws and policies to try to keep ourselves safe. We've made it so that there's no place for people, so they're always stuck halfway home. But what we've done is we've legislated a more violent world. Because disconnection from family, because unemployment, because housing instability. The criminology literature tells us leads to more crime, not less.
Thank you for that. Following up from that question, the afterlife of slavery, that is to say, the afterlife of mass incarceration. Listen,
Yeah.
talk about that.
I was moved by a scholar. We spent so much time on the history, which is very important. I was so moved by a scholar, Saidiya Hartman, who wrote a brilliant and beautiful book called Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, which is about the kind of radical politics of queer life in the progressive era. So she is writing about really marginalized black queer women who are making the decision to live their lives, their full truth, and they're making those decisions with and despite consequence. So folks are losing their jobs, some folks are losing their lives, some folks are being arrested and carted away. Anyway, not in that book, but in a different one. Everyone should read Wayward Lives. It's just a fantastic, powerful, beautifully written, moving, smart book. But in her previous work, and in that work too, she writes about what she calls the afterlife of slavery. And for her, the afterlife of slavery, or the way slavery shows up in ways we might not pay attention to, is poverty, incarceration, and premature death. That's what she says. It's poverty, incarceration, and premature death. My question is, okay, I see that. I can see that. I can see the remnants of slavery, even in moments of pleasure. You know, she writes a beautiful book called Scenes of Subjection that reveals this. I see that. I buy that. I wonder what then is the afterlife of a different type of institution, of maybe the next iteration of a thing. What is the afterlife then of mass incarceration? You know, this thing we've done where 19.6 million people now have a felony record. This thing we've done where now 80 million Americans have a criminal record of some kind, a full 1/3 of all US adults. This thing we've done where 44% of black women have a loved one who's right now today in a cage. This thing we've done where 1 in 8 white women today has a loved one that's sitting in a cage. This thing we've done where 38% of white boys in this country are arrested before they turn the age of 23, but we pay no attention to that because we haven't separated white children from their innocence. And we pay no attention to that because we think mass incarceration stops at the threshold of the black family. We pay no attention to that because we think mass incarceration is a black problem. Mass incarceration is an American problem, right? And so I wonder, what is the afterlife of this thing that's eating alive so many of our loved ones? And I wondered about the afterlife as a spiritual condition too. One that universalizes. In other words, it produces a kind of thing, and it locates us within a cosmos of actors. This is, you know, going a little deeper than I probably want to do tonight, but thank you for the question. You know, but it places me within a kind of people, right? So I've got a criminal record. I'm a kind of person. I'm a criminal, and the criminal is located within a universe, a cosmos of other kinds of things. It's just located at the bottom. It has a place in the cosmos, a terrible place. And that place that it occupies it because of things it presumes you did. I did that. I deserve what I got. And I wondered how does that show up? How do we reckon with this thing, which is a spiritual condition, not just a financial one. It's not just an economic one. It's not just one about criminal law or policy. It is a spiritual condition. And it reflects the spiritual condition of our nation. What is the afterlife of that thing? And so this is what I'm trying to capture in this book. That's the theoretical work that's happening in this book. I'm trying to wrestle with. What does this mean for our democracy? What does this mean for the way we do family? What does this mean for the way we care for one another? What does this mean for how we live together or not? What does this mean for our fate as people who are linked together? That, for me, was the question.
Yes. And we're burning through time right now. But I got to ask this last question.
Okay.
Then we're going to get to the audience. So, and I'm sorry because there's so many questions I wanted to ask, but you know.
I love your questions. These are great questions.
Thank you. So, when I was reading your book and I'm seeing these connections between slavery and mass incarceration, I started to think about the waves of genocide and oppression that have taken form in this country, right? It's founded with the genocide of the Native Americans, right?
Sure.
Then we move into the enslavement and wholesale of African people. From there, we move into Jim Crow, Black codes, right? And then from there, we move into drug epidemics, heroin, so cocaine, crack, and mass incarceration, right? Some would argue now that gentrification is a new wave, but my question to you is, it's kind of twofold, being mindful of time, of course. What's the next iteration of this wave of oppression and genocide? Is there anything in your research that tells us what to look out for next? And is mass incarceration coming to an end? We see a lot of activism around criminal justice reform and so forth, but what's next? Because this sequence of events has been taking place since the foundation of this country. So what do you have on that?
I don't know what the next catastrophe will be. What I know and what history has taught me and what my work has taught me is that there's a root to this thing. And the root to this thing is fear of the other. Fear of the other. And our refusal to make a world in which the other belongs. So my dear friend in the book, Ronald Simpson May, he does 27 years on a wrongful conviction. He was accused of shooting at a police officer. He wasn't at the scene. It's in the book. You'll see it. He wasn't at the scene. He wasn't there when the officer was shot. This doesn't mean that my dear friend wasn't a gun-toting, drug dealing, right? Like he was wild. He was wild. He'll tell you he was wild. Of course he was. Right? He was. But he wasn't at the scene when this officer got shot. He did not shoot this officer. He does 27 years on this wrongful conviction. And about a decade into the wrongful conviction, his son is murdered by a 14-year-old boy. I have no idea what I would have done in that situation. But what Ronald did in that situation was Ronald advocated for the boy to not be tried as an adult. So this was in Michigan. So in Michigan penitentiaries, it was notorious for trying children as adults. And I think you all have had the same problem here. And we see this across the country. I was curious about why Ronald did it. And I asked him, like, yo, did you love this kid? I mean, this kid took Ronald's son. And it wasn't that Ronald loved the kid. I mean, it's not a Lifetime movie, He didn't take him as his own son. They didn't share pizza parties together. They didn't, do family dinners or something like that. They're not on tour, on the speaking circuit or something like that. Ronald said, I did it because it was the right thing to do. I asked him if he forgave the child. He said he eventually forgave the child. It took him a long time to forgive the child. But he said forgiveness can be a platitude. Forgiveness without works is dead, he said to me. He said he advocated for the child to be tried as an adult because he believed the child deserved a place in the world. Whether he changed his ways or not, he deserved a place in the world because he was a human being. And so he did the work that was required of the ethical commitment that he made to create a place where people belong, even people who cause harm. That to me is the courage that we need in this moment. That to me is the point. That is the opposite of the politics of fear that's produced the world of violence that we have today. What we need is a politic of hospitality, a politic of compassion, a commitment to belonging. where we make a world where people belong even when they've caused harm, and even when the harm that they've caused is harm to us. That's the point.
Thank you. I think we'll end it there for right now.
Take questions?
Yeah, we'll take some questions
Absolutely.
from the audience, but thank you for that.
Thank you.
Yes, and am I giving the mic out, or do we have a mic for the audience? Or did you want me to reiterate the question? Reiterate, okay. Yes.
Yeah, so the question was, how do you keep from internalizing all these messages you get about, for example, fear of the other or something like that, and from reproducing the kinds of things that we have today? Am I hearing you?
You said that, for example, the whole image is that, oh, this person is a person of color, they are a violent person. How do you raise children, or how do you, as an African man, keep from internalizing that? How do you say, no, that is not me?
Yeah.
What are the mechanisms?
Yeah. How do you keep from internalizing all these messages about the other? For example, people of color. How do you do that with your children or something like that? I'm trying with my children right now. But I think that it's important that we resist the narrative and tell new narratives. So people are fully human, which means that they make mistakes, that they have problems, that they're not perfect kinds of people. They're not angels and demons or something like that. And I think that we need narratives that promote the intrinsic humanity of people that we've learned to otherize in these ways, people that we've learned to have disdain for. I think that's a big part of it. It's about the stories that we tell. And for my own children, I hope that my own children see my proximity to people that we've marginalized, and to people who we've lauded. So in my house, we'll have dinner with professors and politicians and doctors and lawyers and formerly incarcerated people and trans folks and LGBTQ folks, not because I need a guinea pig to help me with this experiment in parenting, but because I hope that's how I get down. And so I hope that my children see from me an embrace and an openness and willingness to change my own stuff, and I hope that they take that on and perfect it in their own ways and go further than I'm going in my own practice of humanity. But my practice of humanity has flaws and problems, so I have to hear new narratives from folks who think about things differently than I do, and then be open to challenge and change. My own stuff too, so that I'm not promoting and reproducing the kinds of oppressions that we hope to fight against.
Well, I'm speaking surrounding your comment about enslavement and the whole thing of mass incarceration. when you think back into the business of prisons and privatizing prisons and those contracts that were given, that they had to have a certain amount of inmates for these private prisons, how do you feel like that drove the mass incarceration movement, especially in light of the fact that major corporations were contracted with these prisons and hired prisoners at $1 an hour? I think it all rolls down into that.
Yeah, I think the question of privatization is a really important question. I do. Private prisons make up 8 or 9% of the overall share of prisons. But I think your point about contracts and contracting is a really wise one, because if we pay attention to contracting services, for example, we see privatization in a different way. So 8 or 9% of the prison share is, say, private prisons. But the second thing are things like ancillary services, from telecommunication systems to So when I was calling my brother, it cost me about $6.50 a call. The call was for 15 minutes. That was after a series of reforms to reduce the cost of calls. So after reforms to reduce the cost of calls, it costs $6.50 to make a call. This is the world in which we live. In a world with cell phones where calls are effectively free if you pay a monthly paying. It would cost me about $1 an email that I sent, and if it was an email to get them a letter, because they gave out tablets, I would get a note every holiday season. For $1.50 you can send them an e-greeting card. And you can attach pictures. If you want to send pictures to your loved one, it was 20 cents a picture. And he'd always ask me to attach things. Hey, Reuben Scuba, go on my Facebook account and take a picture of this girl who I like, or take a picture of this, whoever. So an email would cost $3. Emails are free. So not to mention ramen noodles, 30 cents a package, boots, $75 that he has to buy through the commissary. These costs sort of add up, and these costs bankrupt families. The Alla Baker Center has a wonderful report called "Who Pays?" That traced the impact of. Where's it up? Oh, I didn't know that. It's super interesting. So, but entire families go bankrupt in this. So when we think about privatization, it's very important for us to think about this question in relation to, on the one hand, the private prisons, on the other hand, what it means to hold somebody in a cage. It costs money, and the family bears the brunt of those costs. And then it costs money to support them when they come home, And then there are fines and fees. There are all these things. I think it's very important. Is it a driver of mass? It is a driver, for sure, I think, of mass, like the costs is a driver of mass. But I don't know that I would put it as the primary one, but that's me. Like, we could disagree about that. It's okay. But it is important, and it certainly does harm families, for sure.
Fantastic conversation. I'm really learning a lot and getting a lot. You spoke at the beginning and a number of times about faith, and I wasn't sure where you were going or where the intersection is between this conversation about faith and the sociology or the research work that you're doing, and I wondered if you could just say a bit more about that. It makes me think of a church in Brooklyn, New York, St. Paul Community Baptist Church, which has wounded healers, people who've had prison experiences or addictions, becoming people who help others who have that. And I don't know if that's along the lines of what you're speaking to, but or is it just with regard to you and other sociologists becoming aware of how spirituality needs to intersect with this? So I wonder if you speak about that. The only other question I have along the same lines is, are people in black churches speaking the language that you're talking, and are people in white churches who have a concern about imprisonment and recidivism speaking the language you're speaking, or quite not?
Yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, on the question of spirituality, I mean, for me, one, it's a part of the tradition that I come out of. So I was a religious guy. I was drawn to this work by scripture. For me, Pentecostal Christian. I was drawn to the work because of Scripture, Matthew 25. In Matthew 25, it asks, it's sort of the end of it's the end of it all. It's what we call the valley of decision. And God is making some decisions. And he's letting people into paradise, or other folks is like, gone, man, like, this ain't happening for you. And some of the folks who he's like, come in or leave or whatever, the decision comes down to how you treated the most vulnerable. So when I was hungry, did you feed me? When I was naked, did you clothe me? When I was sick and in prison, did you visit me? So that part kicked me in the chest. And that's how I got into the work, that part. And I realized I wasn't, in my own practice, I wasn't engaging with this question. And then when I got there, I started to see my neighbors. Because I was born poor and black after 1972, the year that mass incarceration begins in earnest. And of course my neighbors were going to be there. And then my family history. So I meet my father, who I just didn't know. And I meet him, and I learned he had been incarcerated for 20 years. I just didn't know him. Now his incarceration may not have explained why he wasn't there. He could have just been a jerk. You know what I mean? Like that. Two things, or both. Like, two things can be true, right? Like, two things can be true. But that was the case. It wasn't that my family history brought me to the prison. It's that my interests brought me to the prison, and my family history intersected with it. And then my brother gets arrested, of course, while I'm doing the research of the book, because I couldn't have avoided the prison if I wanted to, because I was born poor and black after 1972 in a country that has disdain for black people, and that engages in this practice of communication. Okay, so my spirituality brings me, but it also helps me understand what it is that I'm looking at. It helps me understand where people are placed in a cosmos of actors. What one's position is in the cosmos, right? Like that's the spiritual side of things, how it both universalizes and individualizes, okay? But beyond that, also all this language, this religious language that floats around in this space, redemption, atonement, punishment, like this comes from an understanding of what people owe one to another without really being mentioned or thought through carefully, I think. And so there's a religious root that has done real harm, and there's a religious root that can do real good in this place, but we haven't interrogated it. The question of, is the church speaking this language? I don't think so, unfortunately. Some people, yes, for sure, and others, maybe not so much, because the language that I was speaking when I went in as a volunteer was the language of personal accountability. It was a language of individual behavior and changing yourself. Why don't you just get saved? Why don't you just change the way you think and feel about your circumstances? Why don't you come to the Lord? It's very important, I think, that people do that. I think accountability is important. I think behavior really does matter. But this isn't really a question about behavior, it's a question about citizenship, which to me is also a spiritual principle. It's a question about how we live together, and what it means to be a part of the body, and what it means to be allowed to participate in the body. You know, one's a hand, one's a finger, one's an arm, one's a foot. If the foot offends you, you don't cut it off. But we amputate our parts from the social body. Because somehow we've convinced ourselves to not love ourselves. We're all a part of the body. You know? And for me, this is the spirituality of it. This is the question. How do we live together is the question that motivates my work, and that comes from me, from a spiritual place.
Dr. Miller, any last words, closing words? Anything else?
I think at the end of the day, this is a question about belonging. You know, do we make a world in which people belong, or won't we? That is the measure of our ethics. Those are my last words.
Thank you. And as Matthew said in the beginning, we're going to be having a book signing in the back, and folks can speak with you freely. Thank you.